I spent a lot of my childhood in the woodland forest, both behind and to the left of my grandparents' house. I wouldn't always go into them alone. In fact, more often than not, I had my younger cousin, we'll call him Ben, with me on my misadventures. One in particular really stands out to me. So Ben and I would most of the time just wander around for the first mile of the forest and look for ponds and animal bones and weird fungi. Normal young boy stuff. Well, one year in school, I got a backpack with a little built-in compass on the top. It only really worked if you set it flat on the ground. But hey, it was still a working compass, and that meant we could go a little even further into the woods without the fear of getting lost. So one day Ben and I met at the middle of the levee and started our journey. We got about 3 or 4 miles in when we happened upon a clearing, which isn't necessarily uncommon, but this one was. First thing we noticed is that it was nearly a perfect rectangle, save one corner that was kinda dented from the trees, and about half the size of a football field. The next thing we noticed was the grass. It was completely different there, like that thick, super dark green grass you see on rich people's lawns. Not the thin, scraggly stuff that grew everywhere else, or even the kind some people purposely grew to attract deer to hunt. Yee. I asked my cousin if he knew anybody that lived out this far, thinking it might have been someone's hunting ground or backyard or something. He wasn't sure, so we walked the entire perimeter to try and find a trail or back road. There was nothing like that, just the same thorns and bushes like we all stumbled from. It was like the whole field was just dropped there. Now, if you've been in the woods long enough, you know that a patch of grass, both longer and brighter than the rest, usually is the result of a lot of feces or a dead carcass. Well, in the near center of the field, there was indeed a patch of grass both longer and brighter. We investigated and found it was the latter, at least what was left of it. A long spine with no ribs or skull sat in the middle of the patch. My guess is it was a cow or horse, seeing as how both are prevailed in the farmlands. The odd thing about it was the spine was completely straight, no curve and no slouch, just flat and straight. We decided we were more creeped out than curious at that point and wanted to head home. I knew which direction we came from, but I was excited to use the compass, so I set it on the ground. 3 things struck me almost simultaneously. First, the spine was pointing the exact direction we came from. Secondly, I couldn't hear a single bird, squirrel, or insect. The third was my compass had a crack down the middle. I don't know if you've seen the backpack I'm talking about, but the glass part on the compass is super thick. It would have taken a hammer and determination to crack it, much more than just a simple walk through the woods. Being the big brave cousin I was, I decided not to mention it to Ben, seeing as how he was already a bedwetter. I slung on my backpack with confidence and headed toward home. The next few years we decided on several occasions to make the journey back out there. Only problem is we never found it again. We met at the same place every time, headed in the same direction, and walked what we always felt was more than the same distance. We never found that clearing again. My brother told me about how him and my other cousin, the older brother of Ben, had the same thing happen to them, but with a lean to full of broken glass and bungee cord. I've read up on some stories of people out west finding towns in the desert and never being able to find them again, even though they took the exact same roads. I can only assume we experienced the same phenomenon. Not necessarily scary, but fascinating nonetheless. When I was 14, I walked into our dining room. My little sister, who was 8, was standing partially concealed by the curtains. I spoke to her, and she turned. It was not my sister. The girl was holding a black cat and smiled at me as if she was waiting for me to say something. Then she disappeared. I ran to my mom, scared silly, and told her. My mom is very open to unexplained stuff and never panics. Fast forward 15 years and I am married with 2 daughters, 8 and 12. I walked into the living room to see my oldest standing partially concealed behind the drapes. I speak to her and she turns. She smiles expectantly as she strokes Shadow, our black cat. She doesn't disappear, but she is the girl I saw at 14 in my childhood home. I tell my mom, and she says, well, there you go. Mystery solved. So last Friday, I, a 25-year-old female, had a little time to kill before picking up my kids from school. And it was a gorgeous day, so I decided to spend some time cruising some back roads in my hometown, small and rural, listening to music. I passed this guy with his thumb out, trying to catch a ride, and I almost picked this guy up. He looked to be late 30s, early 40s, carrying a fishing pole and a backpack. Pretty innocent looking, I guess. But see, I'm a lone female, and I've been taught with hundreds of hitchhiker gone wrong stories that you just keep driving. So I kept driving. And as I'm driving, I have this internal dialogue of guilt about my decision not to pick this guy up. You know, if I was hitchhiking, I'd hope someone would pick me up. And I mean, really, what's the worst that could happen? That mixed with my new self-improvement goal of doing things that scare me as often as possible, led me to the conclusion that if when I looped back around he was still walking, I would pick him up. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, he was still there. I was feeling a little nervous pulling over getting him, but what was I going to do? Peel out while he was trying to get in my vehicle? As soon as he gets in, I realize I've probably made a horrible mistake, because he seemed like he was tweaking balls and smelled god-awful. Because this dude was looking at me like I was a feast, and he was starved, I didn't realize exactly how rattled I was with my decision until he asked me for a smoke, and my hands were shaking so bad I barely pulled one out of my pack without breaking it. Driving made it easier to hide my nerves, but I was initially freaking out and trying to decide how I would beat this guy's butt if he did anything. His name was Wayne. He lives about 5 minutes from where I picked him up. Meanwhile, he's telling me how he lost his license due to DUIs and how he's living in his house with an old man. He tried to get him to come home with him, but he didn't want to come, etc. He's also trying to talk me into hanging out at his said house and him to come over and drink with him the next day. When I finally get him at his destination, it's a little shack-like thing, surrounded by all these junk cars and stuff. He gets out and is still trying to get me to come inside with him. I tell him no and leave. I'm feeling really relieved and a little proud that I faced a fear of mine. Fast forward to Monday. My instructor says, "Oh my god, apparently someone got murdered down the so and such road. Do you know anyone down that way?" I say, "Wow, you know, that's really ironic. I took a hitchhiker down that road Friday. His name was Wayne, I think." Probably wasn't 15 minutes later when I see old Wayne's face all over Facebook saying the TBI has picked him up for stabbing someone to death at the very house I dropped him off at on Friday. Graphic information of how he stabbed him in the lungs and the victim bled out in that little shack. And the old man he was living with doesn't even exist. I swear, I'll never pick up another hitchhiker in my life. This happened about 13 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories, I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there is a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off a busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you are almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads, surrounded by trees, very few streetlights, and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights, just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off the main road, driving for 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn, and to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what it was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the feeling we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. And in any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were all 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing, and I mean massive. It was a large open field of unkept grass, comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. Trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I managed to peer between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live here, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on the very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. And by dancing, I mean it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same to another tree. Basically, a do-si-do. The moon was so bright and the woods so dark, It actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him and pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he saw it, he gasped with everything he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the heck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever this was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked out and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was coming. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running, I heard Jay scream, "Oh my God!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were all a safe distance away, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I know everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, and children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others with something to the effect of, "The woods, that really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did he know we were there from the second we parked? Was he the sound that I kept hearing when we were walking through the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around and see what he was truly capable of.